It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Don Hawthorne. He is a go-to-market expert, and one of the things that I have observed in the last 25 years of working is how many great ideas fail at the go-to-market stage. So you have wonderful products, excellent services. It seems like they're going to be a home run, and then they die. And this is often due to deficiencies in go-to-market. Donald Hawthorne is really the expert. He's the president of GTM Hawthorne Incorporated. He was previously the president, CEO, and board member at Daktari Diagnostics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was the president and CEO at Advandex. He was the president and CFO at Ampersand Ventures, a biologics portfolio company in Silicon Valley. And he was also the president of the Bioscience Financial Officers and chairman of their national conference. He is a lifelong learner. He holds a recent digital business strategy certification from MIT, and his MBA is from Stanford in California. Donald, I could go on with your credentials for another 2 hours, but I'm just really excited that you're here to see us. And with that, let's get going with your interesting discussion today on go-to-market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, for those kind words. And thank you, Christian, for all you've done with strategy tools and our prior conversations, and thanks for the chance to talk today. I've got 5 core slides. Let me throw them up and see if I can make this go. Can everyone see this all right? Okay, so building on what Scott said, I've been in the life sciences industry for 38 years, working in or with 48 companies. And along the way, I've held 10 C-suite positions, including 5 CEO roles. And over those years, one question has haunted me. Why are there not more great companies? It's certainly not due to a lack of executive ambition, a lack of investor capital, a lack of breakthrough technologies, or even a lack of ideas. Something is missing. And I've concluded that what's missing is the inability to get go-to-market right. The challenge starts with executives being clear on what go-to-market is and is not. So let's begin there to get some initial clarity. Go-to-market is not the same as commercialization, which is the issues that you deal with typically in the 6 to 12 months prior to product launches. If you're only thinking about go-to-market at that point, you are likely going to have the kind of outcomes that Scott just described. Go-to-market starts much earlier when you have a raw, unproven technology and an unvalidated hypothesis about an unmet market need. And what I have seen and heard that many of the successful companies do is they marry a marketing person with a product development technologist at that very beginning in what becomes a product debate, technology debate, a tug-of-war dialogue from that very early moment all the way through until you either kill the project or retire the product. Most of the companies that I have worked with do not share this perspective, and I think that's a centrally important point. But even if they have that foundational clarity, I find that many executives are unclear on exactly what they should be doing and addressing go-to-market issues on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And since they're busy, they're likely to default to what amounts to conventional wisdom behaviors without even realizing that they're doing so. And by the end of this presentation, I'm going to share with you a GTM Road Map solution to this executive dilemma. To get there, let's first go to a high level. I'm going to provide some initial context on the consequences of conventional wisdom. And then we're going to go more granular and identify 4 tangible habits executives can develop to ensure they don't get seduced by such thinking. Then we're going to go back to a higher level to provide some additional context that will set the stage for the GTM roadmap. That's a framework that executives can use on a daily basis to have the best chance to build a great company. Here is the first high-level context slide, and its overall message is, if you follow conventional wisdom, you will become a negative statistic like those described on this slide. So don't do it. The cost is simply too high for your company, employees, investors, and customers. These big picture costs, these are the big picture costs of following conventional wisdom. 72% of new products fail to meet expectations. 75% fail to reach profitable status and are withdrawn. In 1 year, 20,000 new products were evaluated and only 92 had sales over 50 million in that year and sustained it in a subsequent year. If you look at startups, the number one reason for failure, 42% of all failures, is that they solved the problem. It just wasn't one where there was an unmet market need. And that leads very nicely to the final conclusion, which is, not surprisingly, only 10% of VC investments generate more than a 1 to 5x return. Now, high-level statistics are informative in aggregate because they define the costs at a macro level, but executives need something more specific to guide them so they can avoid falling into the conventional wisdom trap. In other words, what can they do on a weekly basis to avoid becoming one of these statistics? I call this the executive mindset slide. I co-led a webinar in November 2020, during which I asked the participants to answer these 4 questions. Their answers were appalling, but actually typical. Think about it. A majority of people acknowledged that their companies did not ask hard questions, did not map out and test and validate their key product and business model assumptions, and did not have a shared understanding of their customer needs. The behavioral habits embedded in these negative answers are why there are not more great companies. And we'll shortly pivot to how you can successfully act on these 4 habits in the affirmative. But let your executive team's starting point for go-to-market success be to adopt a mindset committed to developing habits that are the opposite of the answers described in this slide. So let's now go back to a higher level and describe the context for these 4 behaviors and why they are so important. If you go to the bottom of the slide, your mission as an executive is to build a great and enduring company. When you cut through all the noise, only 2 metrics matter: dominant valuations and dominant operating performance. And you realize those 2 outcomes through your marketplace interactions with 3 groups: customers, investors, and corporate partners. Now, here's a perspective that I've heard few people articulate. Regardless of whether you're paying attention to them, these 3 groups are constantly evaluating the effectiveness of your go-to-market strategies and performance. And here's what's really striking. You have no direct control over any of the 3 groups. That means, as an executive, you're in the persuasion business. And your persuasion efforts, if you do go to market right, are to take products and services to market in a way that convinces investors, partners, and customers that they should care enough to invest in your company, partner with your company, or buy your product or service. If you want to succeed at these persuasion efforts, you need to offer 3 go-to-market solutions: product market fit, business model fit, and organizational fit, which is, the latter is the glue that holds the other 2 together. So at a high level, apply the mindset of the 4 habits previously described toward the development of these 3 solutions. Let's now get specific and describe how your company can successfully combine these 2 efforts. There's a tremendous amount of business literature out there, and as you know, it grows every day. You've seen it, you've heard about it. There's talk about strategy, innovation, corporate culture, and more. But executives are incredibly busy, and that means few have the time to delve into the deep thoughts of all these great global thinkers, let alone they don't have the time to figure out how to translate those insightful thoughts into something that's actionable at a company level. So they don't. But if they don't, they'll succumb to following conventional wisdom and suffer the consequences we previously discussed. So they must. They don't, but they must. This novel GTM Road Map is a unique and differentiated solution to that executive conundrum. It's curated from global best practices and filtered through a pragmatic operating lens, executive lens. So, I think about it as I prepared it as, hey, if I was still running companies, this is the kind of thoughts that I would be wanting to have. So it's allows executives to say, look, if I maintain a focus on those 4 mindset habits, and I keep this 3x3 in front of me, I'm going to stimulate my thinking and most likely be able to make sure my behaviors keep me on track to go to market success. So now we're going to review the roadmap in more detail. I'm going to share some global thought leader quotes with you so you can appreciate the richness of their insights and how they inform the operational utility of the roadmap. And that's a polite way of saying I'm going to look down at pieces of paper when I read quotes, so I do justice to the quotes. Let's begin with the product market fit column, where the broad goal is to develop a compelling value proposition. For jobs to be done, you really need to understand your customers' jobs. Now think about your experiences. People will talk about product features and get all excited. And if they think they're being really sophisticated, they'll talk about product benefits. The problem is that even the benefits conversation doesn't necessarily tie to what jobs the customers are trying to get done. 3 quotes to add some clarity. Tony Ulwick says, people buy products and services to get a job done. Rita McGrath notes, you're not competing against a product, you're competing against the way a job gets done. Which led, Clayton Christensen then said, the job, not the customer, is the fundamental unit of analysis. If you want to understand your customers' jobs, you need to map out their jobs step by step as they would like to be able to do them if they could do them perfectly. You then need to understand their desired outcomes for each job step. It's only then that you'll have the ability to understand what outcomes they desire are most important and least satisfied. And that will create a clarity about customer needs that can inform how your offerings can meet their needs in unique and differentiated ways. For breakthrough insights, there's many things to think about, and the starting point is to ask early on whether you have identified the key assumptions that, as David Bland says, are both critical for success and yet have the least amount of evidence to support them. Follow Steve Blank's famous advice and get out of the building to focus on testing and validating the assumptions, making pivots when they turn out to be wrong. And the key is to, along the lines of what Peter Sims said, place little bets early on so that you discover new ideas, strategies, or plans through an emergent process, rather than trying to fully formulate them before we begin, because that will facilitate the adaptation of your approach as you go. For value proposition, everyone says you need a compelling value proposition. Well, of course you do. But this quote from Andy Radcliffe, the famous Silicon Valley venture capitalist, defines what compelling really means. What do you uniquely offer that people desperately want? If they're not desperate, there's a good enough alternative. If there's a good enough alternative, you're doomed. If you want to build a big business, people need to be desperate. So what's fascinating about that is then that the key to corporate greatness is to make sure you pursue value propositions that begin as non-consensus beliefs about the market and then turn out to be right over time. Let's now move to the business model fit column, where the broad goal is to develop a profitable and scalable business model. For portfolio management, I really like this quote from Rita McGrath. She mentions how, we now live in a world of transient competitive advantages that require, as she says, learning to launch new strategic initiatives again and again, and creating a portfolio of advantages that can be built quickly and abandoned just as rapidly. Success will require a new set of operational capabilities. What that means is that companies need to innovate to competitive advantages while recognizing that the advantages won't last as long. This means it's even more important that the scale up into the marketplace to capture value be done rapidly and well. And this is where the Strategy Tools Scale Up Coach program is uniquely valuable. Similarly, as the competitive advantage begins to dissipate, companies must transform out of their position and move on to the next wave again and again. And this is where the strategy tools building the transformational company program is a most helpful and differentiated offering. For digital transformation, it's really about strategy and new ways of thinking, not just technology. David Rogers describes the 5 domains of digital transformation this way: harness customer networks, build platforms, not just products, turn data into assets, innovate by rapid experimentation, and adapt your value proposition. Rita McGrath sums it up this way: digital technologies have made it possible to use markets for a lot of work that was once done more efficiently within firms, more of the crowd activities that we have been talking about. In parallel, be aware that digital transformations often require companies to re-engineer their internal business processes in what McAfee and Brynjolfsson describe as the matrix of change. For the business model, we all know that while a business model defines how you create value for customers, a value proposition defines how you create value for customers. A business model defines how you create value for your company. The business model canvas from Alex Osterwalder is a good starting point for identifying your assumptions. And he and David Bland talk about the front stage of the business model, the customer segments, customer relations, channels, and value proposition that asks if your offering is desirable. The backstage of the business model, the key activities, partners, and resources, then asks if your offering is feasible. There's a third question, which is it viable? That's the revenue and costs. And then finally, the external environment factors are at play. Let's conclude this slide by focusing on the organizational fit column to talk about the necessary mindset and behavioral habits that begin. And let's begin in the middle with adaptive high performance culture. I ask 4 questions of executives. Are you forthright with your team about the state of your business? Do you ask catalytic questions? Do you let good people make a difference every day? And do you reward excellence in both learning and execution? These questions are the starting point for developing an adaptive mindset that's necessary to handle the uncertainty that permeates today's business world and while meeting the high performance expectations necessary to win in the marketplace. For value inflection point mindset, CEOs face 3 primary value inflection points over time. Where do you place your initial bets, the scale up of those bets, and the eventual transformation out of those positions? I measure CEOs not on their 15-second commercials, but on their ability to clearly articulate the potential value inflection points they're facing, because that means they're grappling have an unvarnished perspective about their competitive and organizational realities in a way that reminds me of that famous book title from Andy Grove, Only the Paranoid Survive. It's then more likely that their management teams are wrestling daily with the company's opportunities and risks, and routinely grappling with the upside opportunities where you can create new value, and with the downside risks where existing value can be destroyed, means that you're going to have rapid, proactive gathering of market intelligence at the edges. You're going to be challenging the status quo. You're going to have a natural building of a sense of urgency that'll just come from the dialogues, and then that can all lead to a focus on driving value creation. For discovery-driven planning and execution, new ventures face different challenges than existing business operations. And I'll even add that, as Strategy Tools has been pointing out, with the transformation world that's been going on here and the need to move on, even some existing businesses will face the sort of challenge and need to do discovery-driven planning and execution. And Rita McGrath says it this way: discovery-driven planning is a practical tool that acknowledges the difference between planning for a new venture and planning for a more conventional line of business. New ventures are undertaken with a high ratio of assumptions to knowledge, because assumptions about the unknown generally turn out to be wrong. So new ventures have inevitably experienced deviations. So your challenge is to call out the assumptions and then reduce the assumptions to knowledge ratio by converting those assumptions into knowledge as quickly and inexpensively as possible. So to wrap this slide up, we've only scratched the surface of the GTM Road Map today, but here's a parting thought to tease you and for your consideration. Did you catch the interconnectedness between the various 3x3 categories? To wrap it up, let me conclude with some summary advice that I give executives to make sure they have the best shot at go-to-market success. Recognize that go-to-market begins much earlier than most people think. Keep asking the hard questions. Understand your key assumptions and continuously validate them. Be open to changing them as you get new marketplace feedback. And I just love this quote from Andy Radcliffe: savor surprises. There's always going to be a surprise, something you didn't expect. All the value lies in the surprise. Have the curiosity to understand investors, partners, and customers so that you adopt a diligent scrutiny mindset that allows you to understand and what they are routinely looking for so you can persuade them that they should care enough to engage with your company. Find your way to the 3 go-to-market solutions we just discussed. And finally, to the extent that it can help you, use the GTM Road Map as a way to stay focused on what matters most. This tool, combined with a resilient mindset, will give you the best chance to build a great company. I hope you have found this helpful and wish all of you only the best on your journeys. Scott, if I'm ready and happy to take questions if there are any.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Donald. I have 3 pages of notes, so we could go back and forth for a few hours, but I do have a few questions from our partners, and I'll start with one from Harvey Wade in the UK. And he's asking, one of the main challenges is that leaders don't allow the test and learn approach. They want every innovation to hit the bullseye. How do you recommend starting leaders on the path to seeing this in a different way or different light?
It is a fundamental question. And it really goes to the organizational fit category of thinking. I screen potential clients on whether they have the openness that he was just describing. If they don't, I'm not going to waste my time with them. And the way I think you do that over time, and this is where I'm taking my own consulting offering, is that you need to ask them some questions and let them self-evaluate and therefore come to their own conclusions without me being didactic and saying, oh, by the way, you should be doing this. I'd also build on something that Christian Stadler said earlier. When I was CEO a number of times, I encouraged the formation of SWOT, and I played a word game. It was SWOT, teams, and they were 2 to 4 employees. They could not be VPs, so it was everybody below that. They picked the topics, and they would then form the team. We'd publicly announce their initiative, and they'd get to take it to closure. And this really builds on the idea of getting out to the edges, because your salesperson, your marketing person, your technologist, they're actually aware where the snow is melting at the edges. And if you allow them the freedom to form these teams, then you stir it up. And there was a little side effect that I'll just add quickly, that as a CEO, I'd then wander around and encourage this and stir things up. So I was basically taking the ossification that can build in an organization and blowing it up, and also testing my VPs, because if they weren't supportive of these things, there's information in that too.
I like your comment on stirring things up. I can physically picture you doing that, walking around the buildings. That brings me to another question, and this is something I've observed with a number of CEOs that I'm working with. And when they start really to have this transformation you're talking about, they have channel conflict in their go-to-markets, and that channel conflict can become very public, like the case we see right now with Ford in the United States, or it can be more private in some B2B environments. What do you recommend, or how do you counsel organizations to manage channel conflicts as they transform and as they bring really innovative products and services to market?
So it would be easy to say that what I've been talking about applies to that first stage of taking new innovations to market. But what it actually is a mindset and a process that says anytime you have an inflection point, and what you just described as an inflection point, you need to be out there testing the waters, the small bets, the emergent process, so that before you get yourself into a public row, you should be testing the waters and trying to reduce the risks and learn and get clarity such that you avoid what you were just describing. And if you find yourself in that situation, the way out of it most likely is to go back to an emergent process mindset and think and test the waters and validate it accordingly.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really hot topic at the moment. I have a question from Jacobo in Colombia, and he's asking, in average, how many ideas must be generated and validated to finally catch that one that has the major impact on your P&L?
It's surprisingly low. I mean, it's single digit typically. I mean, if you want to talk about anything that's worth more than 50 million a year in revenue. So you have to, what I didn't spend as much time on is you really need, under the portfolio management side, you need to have a screening mechanism that allows you to test a number of different potential projects. Mm-hmm. And you fund them to some sort of milestone test point. And you flunk them if they don't. That's that marrying the marketing person and the technologist early on. And then you flunk a number of them. You allocate some money, you give them some time, and then you expect that more often than not, they will fail. And what you have to do from a cultural standpoint is recognize. That's why I said the importance of learning and execution. Your company needs to reward learning, even if it's learning failure moments, so that you can apply the learnings from those failures to some future situation.
Yeah, thank you. I have time for one last question, and this comes from Dr. Frederick Coffier, who's a partner of ours in Belgium. And he's asking, when dealing with the pharmaceuticals, the market access, the national dynamics can be a leverage or an obstacle. How do you see this within the GTM mindset?
It's not a particularly open channel, is it? So, I think you have to, it just is what it is. You've got regulatory approvals, you've got the reimbursement issues that have to be dealt with. What that means in practical terms is you have to go back to the earlier stage and say, okay, what's our data? What does the data show? How do we get KOLs to generate similar data? How do we get them to publish and talk about the data such that you begin to develop a consensus? It's really, if you go to Jeffrey Moore's curve, it's the idea of you don't want the bleeding edge people. I mean, you like them, but they're not going to change the world for you. What you want is you want to use the KOL world to get the early adopters, so you begin to develop influence that can then impact what is otherwise a very structured and rigid process.
Donald, thank you for that. As Lakshmi, one of our partners in India, is noting, your LinkedIn blogs on Go-to-Market are a must-read, and I fully agree with that. They are very detailed. As well, you mentioned a number of the Strategy Tools programs throughout your talk today. We didn't pay Donald to do that, or at least I'm not aware of any invoices. No, but you did not. I really appreciate you mentioning that, and we will be supplying links to all these programs when we distribute the materials. Donald, a sincere applause and thank you from Italy to Boston. And I see many people around the world also so appreciative about what you shared with us today. And there are many questions in the chat. I don't know if you have time to answer them, but if you do, that would be greatly appreciated. And the audience, please feel free to share further questions with Donald. He's got a really deep knowledge on this.